Hey guys, if you can see us, I have no idea at the moment. It's just loading. But if you can see us, we're just 2 minutes.
No. I can't see anything.
Guys, term 2, we've got just warning in advance from 4 different locations around the world. So if there's any delay at some point, then that's why. It should be pretty smooth. We've tested it out, and it seems to work well. If you have any questions or throughout, feel free to post in the thing. I can see Will already put in some pizza and drinks, so that's good. But yeah, if there's any question at any point that you want to ask, then just type it in the chat box underneath on YouTube, and then we'll answer them. I'll keep an eye on it. As for the weird, as some of you may know, that has the camera right next to the keyboard, and so that's why you get to see the keyboard as well. So just out of curiosity, does anyone have any questions before we get going about PhotoClub in COVID times at all? No, if not, okay, we'll get cracking with the announcements then. So obviously it's a little bit of a different setup to usual. We still hope to get through tutorials that we normally cover. The outings will obviously not be happening for the moment, but we'll update you on changes. And then we've also got our competition going as well. So first up, we'll well, it's frozen already. We've got a WeChat which we set up for those of you that are interested for the club. That QR code that's there, and we've also been posting that up on our social medias as well. And that's just another way for you to interact with us, which we thought would be especially useful during these times, considering that everything's more online. Sorry, it's frozen. There we go. So portrait photography is our first after this one. So today we're obviously covering night photography and hold on guys, we're just trying to fix it, it won't be long. Okay guys, so hopefully this has improved it. I'll just give this a go and just let me know how it's going. Okay, so a little bit about our challenges. So UNSW Photo Club 2020, and then there's a prize up for grabs for those. So yeah, if you have any questions, let us know. It's a maximum of 2 photos, and just put the hashtag UNSWP when you submit in the group so that we know that it's for the competition. So so then there's also the normal weekly shout out that we do, and this is the photo for this week's shout out. Now I'm guessing that this wasn't taken right with, or maybe it was, but nice photo nonetheless, and so we'll give you a bit of a shout out on Instagram and Facebook. So we'll now go on to astrophotography, and that's the main part of this tutorial. And for some of those things, the issues that we're having, it should go a little bit smoother. So this photo taken here was not taken in Australia, but there we go. So it's something if you want to have a look for a seeing of the photo. We'll talk about more of the technical details later on. But on to a few examples that I wanted to show you.
And check Facebook chat.
Sorry for the delay, guys. We didn't have this issue before. We're not sure why it's really delayed. Anson, I think keep an eye on Facebook, and that way it might be easier because it's really delayed. So if you can keep an eye on Facebook, then we can communicate via that. Yes. The slides are not changing. Yeah, keep an eye on Facebook, and then I'll tell you on there. Okay, so guys, hopefully it'll be a little bit smoother from here. So essentially, this is one of the photos that we had a member or an exec now take on the road trip. This was a road trip to the Blue Mountains. And so the reason I wanted to show you this one is because sometimes a lot of the time people will say, oh, you need to be in absolute darkness and way away from city lights, which sure, that can help a lot of the time, especially if you want to capture the Milky Way. But this particular photo was actually just shot off, I think it's called Echo Point in the Blue Mountains, which is quite near the lights. Now, sure, it's not as brightly lit up as a place like Sydney, for example, but don't give up just because you're not in a completely rural location, and you can seek out something. And then the other reason I wanted to show you this is just because astrophotography astrophotography photos are not all about the sky. Sure, that's a large part of it, but also think about what objects you have nearby, whether it be the land, architecture, an object, and think about how you can frame your photos or add a little bit of flavor to your photos through including them in your composition. And so that's an example of this here. And now you may have issues where, for example, the object that's in the foreground has a very different lighting setup to the sky, but you can do something, for example, like layering or stacking of photos, where you capture one in a certain exposure and the other in another, or it may be dark, and that may suit the situation as well. So another example from the Blue Mountains trip. Is a photo by my brother. And so you can still see that there's the same object, but then you're just changing the position of it. So you can play around with that. And as you can see, we've managed to capture the color quite a bit in the Milky Way, despite there being, despite us being right near a town. And so that part of that was during the photography, and then part of that is also with a bit of post-processing. But the post-processing was not adding any fake coloring or something like that. It was purely adjusting things like the brightness, contrast, highlights, shadows, to accentuate certain parts of it. So it's certainly not fake coloring, it's just making it, bringing out the colors that you might want. That said, if you want to go down the path of altering the colors, that's your prerogative. The next photo is one I took, again in a similar location, but this time it did not include the object in the foreground. And so basically the reason I'm showing you so many from the same location is just to show you what variety you can get even in one particular spot. Now, don't feel that we suddenly took all these photos in about 5 minutes and then we're out of there. We actually spent about an hour and a half there. So it's certainly a waiting game, patience game. You need to set it up, test the photos, take a few more, and eventually you get one. Pretty much like anything in photography, it's a trial and error. Even the best photographers out there will have thousands of bad photos or thousands of not as good photos for one or two of the final photo that they're seeking. And this is just another example how you might capture, for example, a shooting star, and you still have the landscape in the foreground, but you're capturing a bit more, as I said, a bit more of the flavor of the place you are, so that you can try associate the astrophotography with a particular location. So yeah, the next example is a bit of a different type of photo. There we go. So this is an example of how you can capture the movement of stars, the one that was alongside the equipment slide. So you're essentially taking a longer exposure photo, and if you think about it, they're constantly rotating, and so you will get that motion of the stars if you have a long enough exposure. Bear in mind that that sometimes you might not like it because it's not as crisp, because you are capturing movement, and that's just down to your taste and something you want to do. You may capture this either by doing a very long exposure photo, long shutter speed, for example. You might use what's called bulb mode, where you can click the shutter speed and hold it down and then let go when you're finished. Now, of course, you don't want to be physically holding it down that whole time, so what you can do is you can get a remote shutter release. A lot of them have a function where you can lock the button in place, and then when you finish the photo, you unlock it. And that way, number one, you don't have to hold it down the whole time, and number two, you don't have to bump the camera because you're not actually touching the camera. So some other equipment options are warm clothes. Often you're doing this at night, of course, in colder locations. So make sure you dress up so that you can stay there for as long as you want. Sturdy tripod is really important. Sometimes you can weigh down the tripod as well. Can help, especially if you're in a windy location. Headlamp or torch is really important because you don't want to have too much background light, especially if you've got others taking photos at the same time, because you don't want to disturb their photos. So that can help, which I'll say a little bit about later, because you won't be able to see it as well. So it's nice to know where all the buttons are, so you might not even need to turn your torch on all the time. In terms of what sort of lens, a wide angle is often good for this, especially one that has a low f-stop or a large aperture. So a large opening, but a low f number, and this will allow you to capture more light essentially. And you can also have your batteries kept warm in your pockets, for example. But yeah, so in terms of talking about the ideal viewing time, there's a few different things I want to cover in terms of ideal viewing time. One of them is the months and when to take it. Now, it's actually, in terms of Australia and the Southern Hemisphere, best to take it around the winter months in general, or April to July, if you want a more specific set of months. But in the Northern Hemisphere, it would be more like March to October, and Southern February to October if you want like a wide range. Now, in terms of the moon phases, it's best to actually shoot close to or during a new moon. And sure, it's not completely necessary. You can take the photos whenever you want. But the reason for that is, therefore, you don't have as much brightness from the moon. And therefore, it doesn't take away from the rest of your photo. Now, this, as it says there, allows for reduced light washout from the moon, and making it easier to capture more crisp stars. And it actually even makes a difference with the naked eye. So when you've got like a full moon, for example, you might see hundreds of stars in the sky versus thousands if you have a new moon. And the next slide here is going to show you the different benefits of the different times of the moon phase. So you'll see new, you can shoot anywhere between sunrise and sunset. Sorry, that's when the moon rise will occur at sunrise and the moon set will occur at sunset. And this means that you've really got the whole night where the moon's not up and not disturbing your view. And this will change in different times of the moon cycle. And you can look at this in more detail or refer to this, all these slides we put up on our website. If you need a reminder of where the link is, just let us know. It's also in the weekly email, to look at those details there. Okay, so next what I wanted to talk about sorry, for some reason it's not going. There we go. So this is just another example of how you can even have and okay, so for the next, we're going to talk a little bit about light pollution. One of the main sources of light pollution, of course, is the towns that are nearby. Another thing is the lights that you're using. So it's best to shoot naturally in a dark environment with little to no light pollution, unless you want to achieve a different sort of effect, such as the last photo. Don't just consider the light right around you, such as your light or a street light or something like that. Think about the town and what's in the distance, because you'll be surprised how far away something can really distract from the photo. So the next few slides are just going to be going through different tips rather than examples. So, for example, the weather. Clear skies are naturally of benefit. The cloud coverage will change constantly, though, so it's hard to plan. You have to be willing to give it a trial and error sort of go. So keep an eye on weather apps. You can do that, but that's not always 100% reliable. You may need to get several attempts to get the best weather. But sometimes the clouds can have a nice effect as well. So it all depends what you want to achieve. Camera. So we'll talk a little bit about camera settings now. So know your camera, like I was saying before. Experiment beforehand because it's hard to adjust it in the dark. Play with your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. They're really important. You really can't get away with auto in night photography. You need to, for example, use a longer shutter speed to capture the stars more brightly, to let more light in, especially if you want to show movement. You want a wider aperture, like I was saying before, which means a smaller f number. And ISO, oh sorry, I shouldn't say PRN, that's me getting too bogged down in my studies. What that means is just as required, so change it as you need it. So for example, if you likely you'll need a higher ISO because it is quite dark, but just play around that last. So set the others as as long shutter speed as you can and a wider aperture or small f number as you can, and then adjust the ISO as necessary. So take a few test shots. Focus to infinity. It's generally the best way to go. Actually, what I normally do is if you've got the focus ring on the lens, I go all the way to infinity with that and then back a little bit. And that's often appropriate for the focus that you need, because if you really think about it, the stars are billions of whatever away from you. So you need to, you don't need to, that the exact fine balance of focus is not as important. However, that is still something to keep in mind. You can adjust, for example, by zooming in with digital zoom on your camera, using a plus minus button, for example, and trying to focus on a bright star. So white balance is also really important. Often it's best to use Kelvin, K. It normally looks like a K on your camera to adjust its setting. It really depends on where you are, what works best, but this is just to give you an idea of how varying it can really make a difference to your photo. There's no one right answer about what it could be. You might want a cooler photo, such as the 3200 on the left here, or you might want a much warmer photo, 4800. The link at the bottom of this slide here gives you some more tips on choosing the right white balance, and it'll again be on the slide that we upload to the website. I'll just fill in a little bit of time here while we wait to kick over. Oh, there we go. So a few more tips about the camera. So either a very long shutter speed, as I was saying before, and you've got to balance the clarity of the stars versus the light pollution. You can do stacking even over 1 to 3 hours. You can take heaps and heaps of photos if necessary, and can take a few dark frames, for example, where you essentially are black, and that's to reduce the noise when you're post-processing, because if you have a black photo that's very quick, therefore not a lot of noise, and you can because you can adjust the ISO, so there's not a lot of noise, then that can be helpful to increase the clarity. If you're wondering a minute ago why I was silent while what looked like it was probably the correct slide for you, there's just a slight delay. As I mentioned before, we're broadcasting across different locations in the world. We wanted to try keep this going ahead nonetheless, and we'll try out different methods. We might try out something like Discord. We'll just see what works best. So in terms of useful websites regarding weather, there's a site called Dark Site Finder that'll actually show you which locations have a particularly dark place that's good for astrophotography. It's basically a darkness version of a weather chart. And then you've also got Bureau of Meteorology, and that will naturally help you with the weather. So a few other useful apps, or before websites, now apps are listed there. You can have a look at that in your own time. We won't go through them in detail now. If you have any particular questions, you can always ask. Excuse me. Post-processing will be covered later in the tutorial. Clarence will be doing a little bit on that next. Comes Ignite and Astro together, but they're similar concepts a lot of the time. And so the last thing, well, I guess just to mention on the editing is stacking, like I mentioned before, is quite good. Main thing is not necessarily adjusting the photo to be fake, if you will, but just adjusting highlights, brightness, contrast, to make the stars visible and avoid graying out of the black sky. So the last thing is coming back to this photo, which I promised I would at the start. So this is a photo I took of the northern lights, actually. And a few things I wanted you to think about. Can any of you comment below on what you think are the things that I wanted you to point out in this particular photo? Maybe you're all asleep, or maybe you're here, so I just thought I'd give it a minute and see what you guys think. Or you can tell me it's a crap photo, that's fine as well. But just let me know what sort of points do you think I might be wanting to make with this particular photo. What techniques can you see? I know that there's an Amy and a William on at the moment. No one's wanting to comment anything at all? Want me just to talk through it? Okay, so essentially the main things I wanted you to point out was, again, like I was mentioning earlier, thinking about including something else in the foreground just to add some spice to your photos. In this case, it's the skidoos that you can see on the right, right foreground. Just so it's not the stock standard astrophotography photo. There's nothing wrong with those. Do those as well, but just to vary it up. The other thing here is when I originally took this photo, it was quite close to black. So don't feel that just because your photo is quite close to black that you can't get anything out of it. Editing is very powerful. I didn't do any adjusting of the coloring. I purely adjusted highlights and shadowing and things like that, and um, and that really brought out these green colors. In fact, the story behind this photo is that at the time we didn't see anything with the naked eye, and the tour guide said, "Why don't you take a photo? I think there might be northern lights in the distance over there." And so I took a photo, 30-second exposure, not that long actually, 30-second shutter speed, and it turned out to be this. So sometimes your camera is a lot more powerful. It can pick up things you can't see otherwise. And I may have, sometimes you might find that there are a few stars that are quite bright and might detract, so you can use like spot touching up if you wanted to, or you can keep it completely natural. That's just something else you can consider. And the other thing to consider is is what point you want to keep in focus. So for me here, it was this, I needed the skidoos in focus as well as the sky. Often infinity will work for that, but you might need to adjust it. But yeah, that's pretty much all I had. Is there any particular questions about astrophotography before I head off? Or when I say head off, I mean pass to the next person. But Clarence will be speaking next about doing a bit of an editing demo, and then Shadab will be talking about night photography more broadly. But if there's no particular questions now, feel free to shoot me an email or a text or a message on Facebook, whatever's best for you at any point, and I'm always happy to answer a question. Otherwise, hope you're doing well in these difficult times. Stay safe. And as I said, feel free to get in touch with me with any questions whatsoever. Thanks, guys. Clarence will head over now. Just give us a minute and we'll get up his editing demo.
Hi guys, so today I'll just be covering some applications of what you can do in a dark environment, mainly light painting and long exposure. And then after that, I'll be doing some live editing. So moving on to light painting. Light painting is pretty self-explanatory, but and it's really easy to do, and it produces a really cool effect. And all you really need is a camera set to manual focus, obviously, a light source, the most important thing. You can vary a lot and be really creative with what you choose. Obviously, tripod, and not necessary, but a remote shutter is recommended. So how we do it is we obviously adjust our settings. Ideally, we want a long exposure. We can either set it to bulb or to a long exposure about 10 to 30 seconds. I prefer bulb because it allows us to do whatever we want with our painting, and then we can close the shutter afterwards. Typically, we use ISO 400 and f-stop of 7.1, but that's really depending on what environment you're shooting in and what you prefer. And obviously, since we are shooting for such a long exposure, we want to mount our camera on our tripod and to keep it as steady as possible. And if you're not shooting with a remote shutter, I recommend setting a 2-second timer before before the shutter releases, just so that when you press the actual shutter release button, the camera shakes a bit. So the 2-second timer is there so that it mitigates that shake. So secondly, we want to focus. depending on our environment, we could either autofocus on an object that's brightly lit at where we want to do the light painting, or we could set our focus to infinity. And obviously that makes it easier if we have a high f-stop. And lastly, we just shoot. We just release the shutter button, and depending on if you have a remote shutter or not, you can set it to however much you want. And we'll move on to some quick examples. The first one is just an example I grabbed off the internet. It's somebody using steel wool, and they're spinning it around on a rope. And as we can see, it creates a lot of sparks and a really nice effect. And it's really cool, but I believe if you, it's not recommended in enclosed spaces, particularly in Hellenberg's tunnel, where I think they had a problem with fireflies getting killed off or something. So if you do try this, recommended to try in an open environment. And same thing with Taha's photo. Taha's one of our execs on the right, and not as exaggerated an effect, but still really cool regardless. Okay, so moving on to long exposure nightscapes. So when we shoot at night, we're obviously constrained by what settings and what exposures we can choose. So in order to keep the image quality high, we can't turn our ISO up that much. Otherwise, we'll end up with a grainy image. But we, and in order to let in as much light as possible, we assume that we let our aperture be as large as possible. So that means an f-stop that's as small a number as possible. However, that means we have to turn our exposure up. And that might mean an image that turns out shaky or not that great quality. So usually this means that we have to mount our camera on a tripod. And there's a lot of possibilities that come from that. We could either choose a very short exposure. I believe I took this, this was taken with 1/30th of a second. And the next photo, which I also grabbed off the internet, was taken with a 30-second exposure. So if we compare the two, we can see that in the long exposure shot, the water's surface is glassy, and it removes moving elements. So obviously during a 30-second exposure, any objects that are moving in the frame will have moved out of it, right? And with a 30-second exposure, because it's a dark environment, we can essentially remove those elements. And it's not as obvious because it's dark, not as much light is in the image. And like I said, it smooths moving surfaces and makes things nicer symmetrically, I suppose. And the benefit of shooting at night is that there's no ND, you don't need an ND filter. Could we move back a frame? Yeah. And our light sources, artificial light sources, would be more blown out and a little bit more intense. And that's the benefits as opposed to a short exposure. So really all you need to shoot long exposure nightscapes is a camera shooting in manual focus, which most cameras should, and also shooting in manual settings, a tripod, and ideally a remote shutter. Keep in mind that what I said about light paintings with regards to remote shutters also applies here, meaning that if we want to shoot, it's best to set a 2-second timer before the shutter releases if you're shooting without a remote shutter, and an exposure of 30 seconds is usually more than enough. So how we do it is quite simple. You just set it up as you normally would. Keep in mind your environment and what elements you want to highlight, and shoot in manual with the settings that you want, obviously adjusting for exposure. I believe there's a few apps or a few pieces of equipment that help with exposure calculation. And that's it. You just shoot, and then hopefully your image turns out just fine. What's also recommended is you can shoot multiple shots with different exposures and combine them in HDR. And Anton's provided me some photos for me to demonstrate that in live editing. And if we move to the previous frame, I forgot that there's a lot of elements that can be accentuated when you shoot long exposure. That includes obviously car lights, as you can see on the top right. And we've seen this before, but the water surface becomes glassy and looks a lot nicer than the choppy water surface on the bottom. Okay. Okay. So today I'm gonna edit two photos. The first one being a quick, not so long exposure of Shanghai. So one of the first things that I do when I come across night shot like this is obviously being a night shot. I want to accentuate the fact that it is actually at night, which means that I'll have to somehow make the glow of the buildings less obvious. And you can manually adjust your exposure settings, but I usually like to set it to auto and then adjust accordingly. Didn't do what I wanted it to do, so I'm going to make it slightly darker. I'm going to change this to -1. And I'll have to turn everything back up. So adjusting highlights, going to make it slightly more obvious to be a bit darker. So I want that dark sky. And the white, no real need to adjust that. And I'm going to set the blacks back to the black to 0. Cool. I'm also going to turn the saturation slightly down and the vibrance. I'm going to slightly up the dehaze to get rid of any haze or smoke. So it looks a bit nicer than previously. A lot of the lights are less blown out, and sometimes you want that. In case I don't, because I want to accentuate the detail. And the night sky is obviously a lot darker. Another thing I forgot to mention is I want to set the profile and chromatic aberration and adjust this accordingly. Cool. So I'm going to set the white balance. I feel like this is slightly too cold, so I'm going to turn this up to about 4,000, and I'll see what this looks like. Looks a bit nicer. I'm thinking of adjusting the tint anyway, so I'll bump this up to a lot. Let's see what this looks like. Okay. Trust me on this. It might look weird now, but I feel like what we'll be able to do is make it look a lot nicer. So the vibe I'm going with this photo is Shanghai is obviously a modern city, so I want to kind of give it off that kind of impression. And that will probably involve calibration of colors. And some of you might disagree with this, but from a stylistic standpoint, the colors in this photo are quite all over the place, and I kind of want to make it more consistent. So to do that, I usually adjust my green primary up slightly and my blue primary down. So we can see that there's a lot of that the image becomes a lot more consistent. It's much more blue and red. And I'm going to turn that down. And in my opinion, obviously in this iteration of the photo than previously. And apart from that, there's a few adjustments that we can make to make the colors more consistent. And that would come from just adjusting the hue here. And that's pretty much it for this image. So we'll move on to the images that Anson provided me. He provided me 3 images of Hong Kong. I took the time to merge them into a singular image using HDR because it takes a while and I don't want to waste too much of your time. But we can see that there's 3 different images set at 3 different exposures. And when we combine them, we get an image that has nicer balance to the exposures. So I did some, so I'm going to edit this to make it less warm, mainly because, again, I want the skies to be a bit darker, being at night, but I also want to keep the colors and the detail in the lighting. So I'm going to try doing auto again. It's a bit nicer, but I want to turn down the shadows because the trees in the foreground are too visible. I want to turn that down to about here and turning down the white as well. And I'm also going to turn down the exposure slightly so that everything becomes much more evened out. And now I'm going to adjust the white balance. I'm going to adjust the white balance so that it becomes a bit colder. I would say about 3,800. Yeah, looking much more like Hong Kong. So I'm going to also adjust the tint up a bit. I like my images a bit purple. And we can see that it's slightly looking more like night. I'm not exactly sure if I want to keep it as a strictly night image, so we'll keep it as this for now. Okay, so moving on, I don't believe there's much that we need to do in terms of hue, saturation, or luminance. Everything looks pretty okay here. I might actually turn up the dehaze a bit, just so that it's a bit more clear at the bay. And then afterwards, just going to adjust, calibrate the colors again. I don't think adjusting it to what I did for the Shanghai photo would be good. It might look, yeah, it looks too accentuated here. There's too much imbalance between the foreground and the background, so I'm just going to turn it down slightly to about here. So it's a bit, but not too much. And I'm also going to turn up the green primary to about there. And it's looking a lot more balanced out in terms of the foreground apartments. The colors aren't as orangey red, and the background's more mellowed out as well. And it's looking a lot more colorful, a lot more neon. And yeah, I feel like I'm pretty happy with this image. We could also adjust the aspect ratio so that it's a bit more, there's less sky and more city. But apart from that, that's basically it for live demo. Up to you. So all in all, use calibration as you wish. My nighttime image is darker, so adjust your exposure settings to your liking accordingly. Okay, cool. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the UNSW PhotoClub Facebook page, and we'll be sure to help you out. And come along to our workshops, and I'll be handy.
So, hi guys. Thanks, Clarence, for showing us the different types of night photography on the live demo. So what I'll be going over is the features you should look for in purchasing your gear, the technicalities and the basic techniques you need to know about to improve the quality of your night/low light images. Just one sec. So we'll know about the megapixel race between the smartphone manufacturers and who can pick your camera. So recently, this year and last year, we saw Xiaomi produce a 100 megapixel sensor camera. The Samsung S20 Ultra has just recently introduced a 100 megapixel sensor camera. But my question is high megapixels always a good thing, especially in low light? Well, among our non-photographer friends, we often see the fact they question us on the why would I want to buy a $10,000 20 megapixel camera when my phone has a 100 megapixels? Well, one of the key factors is that a better low light camera will produce better images during uncontrolled lighting scenarios. Not every time or not everywhere or not everyone will have an on-camera flash or studio lights. So in these uncontrolled lighting conditions, we can use and see the true difference between a smartphone and a professional camera. So when we're assessing a camera for its capability in low light, we need to consider both the number of pixels and the sensor size. Well, in fact, among photographers, we always want the highest megapixel camera that we can get our hands on, the fastest response time, and the low noise camera. Wait, one sec, guys. We're just having a few technical difficulties. Hang on a sec. Yeah, so getting back to the point. So when we're assessing a camera for its capability in low light, we need to consider not only the number of megapixels it has, but the sensor size. And as I just mentioned before, all of us photographers want, 45 megapixel, 60 megapixel camera with very fast response time, a lot of frames per second, and low noise. Well, this camera doesn't actually exist, and it will never exist unless someone breaks the laws of physics. Now, as a general rule, the greater the sensor size and the lower number of megapixels, the better the low light performance the camera has. The larger the sensor size, it's more able to collect light, and the more light they can collect, the cleaner and clearer the photograph, and the less noise it will have. And we can think of this idea as like a bucket. The bigger the bucket you have, the more rain you can collect, so there's more light means lower levels of noise. But to get a more comprehensive answer, we actually need to analyze the actual pixel size, which is dependent on the density of the pixels in the sensor. Now, this whole debate of pixel density and low light performance is very complex and debated. But to put simply, the larger the pixel, the higher maximum signal capacity per pixel, which is technically called the full world capacity, and thus the greater low light sensitivity, resulting in less read noise per unit of the sensor area. And just going to the next slide. Now, despite the countless arguments you see on the internet about pixel size and low light sensitivity, the proof is in the pudding. In the professional industry, we can see that a low megapixel large sensor camera has the capacity to produce much cleaner images than a moderate megapixel large sensor camera. We see here we have the C100 Mark II, which is about an $8,000 to $10,000 camera. In the same lighting conditions, the ISO on this specialized $30,000 2 megapixel Canon camera is much lower and the quality of the image is much higher. So this we can actually see that the pixel density has a huge factor on the low light performance of your camera. So after getting an idea about what camera we should get, let's see what the criteria is for getting a good lens for low light. Now, in general, when we want to find a low light/night photography lens, we want to be using a wider angle lens because these lenses are less prone to camera shake than telephotos. You can actually see this by using your phone. So using the digital zoom on your phone, you can just try to take a picture in the normal field of view and then pinch in and see how unstable and difficult it is to actually make the image stable. Now, the second point you should consider is getting the lowest aperture possible for your budget. Nowadays, anything less than f2.8, it's pretty expensive and the prices can skyrocket. But we can see here that as the aperture gets faster, the opening of the lens gets bigger, the more light you can get in, the better the low light performance. The key is the amount of light that your camera can get. And the third point is eye image stabilization, which can be in body or on the lens. This is preferred but not always necessary, and I'll go into more elaborate detail later on in the presentation. So just to get an idea for the different camera bands and what lens is recommended by myself, for Canon, most of the Canon shooters out there know the Nifty 50, the 51.8. It's basically the best bang for the buck lens you can get on the market right now. It has amazing low light capabilities at f1.8. As I mentioned, it has a very big opening in the lens. It's lightweight and it's cheap. The one con of the lens is that it has an 85mm field of view, which is more like a telephoto aspect field of view. So it's quite narrow and it's quite restricting in terms of what type of photography you can do at night. A very good zoom lens at a very reasonable price is the Sigma 17-70 f2.8 to f4. So the f2.8 to f4 means that at the widest angle it's going to be f2.8, and at the telephoto end it's going to be f4. But as I mentioned earlier, you want a lens with a wider field of view, so there's less shake. So at the useful field of view at 17mm, it's going to be f2.8, which is great. So it's great low light for a zoom lens. f2.8 is the lowest you can go on a crop sensor camera right now for a zoom lens that has stabilization. It has a great zoom range, so an effective zoom range from 26mm to approximately 110mm. So it's quite useful other than night photography. And that wide 26mm field of view for the crop cameras is very useful. Now, a super specialized night photography low light lens is the Sigma 18-35. It basically has the fastest aperture you can get for a zoom lens, and it has a very wide field of view at 27mm for a crop sensor camera. The two cons with the lens is that it has no stabilization. You have to consider that when you're taking pictures and video. And the second con is that you need a higher end crop sensor camera because of the f1.8. You need a good autofocusing system, which is sometimes difficult for the beginner cameras. Now, for Nikon's 35mm 1.8 is very similar to the Canon lens, but the good thing about the Nikon lens is that it has a 50mm field of view for crop sensor, so it's much more useful in everyday scenarios. And I still recommend the Sigma 17-70 and the 18-35, which are great lenses for the Nikon crop sensor system. So moving on to Sony. Now, a disclaimer for Sony lenses, they are quite expensive because in general, the way Sony markets their cameras is that they have very attractive price point for the bodies, and then they make a bunch of their profit, the bulk of their profit on their lenses. So for Sony, a great lens is a 16mm f2.8. It's very small. It's called a pancake lens, so it's like stuck right onto the camera. It's very hard to notice you actually have a lens on. It seems like a all-in-one camera. It has a 24mm field of view for a crop camera, which is very useful. It has very decent low light performance, and a negative is that no stabilization. The Sigma 16mm f1.4 is basically the best low light performance lens you can get for the Sony system in terms of that price point. Similar wide field of view at 24mm, and negative is no stabilization. Now here comes to the pricey one, the Tamron 70-28. It's one of the best bang for buck cameras you can get right now on the market. Lens you can get right now on the market. It has f2.8 throughout the whole zoom range. From 17 to 28mm, you get f2.8, which is great. And the price, even though it's quite steep from all the lenses I talked about, it's quite competitive in the market right now. In terms of Fuji, all their lenses, it's widely known that Fuji makes one of the best lenses for color rendition. So all the lenses have best-in-class colors. For the most affordable lens for low light / night photography is a Fuji XF 27mm. It's very lightweight and portable. It has a pretty good 41mm field of view for crop cameras. But like most of the prime lenses that I'm talking about, it has no stabilization in the lens. But one of the points I want to mention is that just because it doesn't have stabilization in the lens, if you buy a body with stabilization, all the lens that you put on the body will be stabilized. So that's just one thing you should consider. Now, the best kit lens you can get right now, the Fuji 18-55 f2.8 to f4. It's very decent wide 27mm field of view for the crop camera, and it also has image stabilization as well. And the pricing is pretty competitive, especially if you buy with a body. Now, the Fuji XF 35mm f1.8 is also a very good lens for the price. As I said, best-in-class colors for Fuji lenses. It is the best low light performance you can get for a crop sensor camera. and has a very decent 53mm field of view for crop sensor cameras, which, according to a lot of photographers, is the same field of view as the human eye. Now, we talked about image stabilization in lenses. Let's talk about that and image stabilization in the body. Now, image stabilization is a modern invention that is especially prevalent in the mirrorless cameras. This will allow you to shoot with much lower shutter speed, which is useful in low light. Now, IBIS moves by moving the sensor inside your camera in order to compensate for the camera movement. Now, for the cameras that have IBIS, they actually have a built-in accelerometer. They'll actually measure the lateral motion, and it will correct the sensor, actually physically moving the sensor left, right, and up and down to compensate for this shake. Some cameras also have a gyroscope as well built in that detects rotational movement. So these include the Nikon mirrorless system, the Sony mirrorless system, and the soon-to-be released by Canon, which have 5-axis image stabilization. So horizontal, vertical, yaw, pitch, and roll. Now, for optical image stabilization, it's very similar to, one second. So optical image stabilization is very similar to in-body stabilization. However, the difference is that, well, for optical, it's actually within the lens, while in-body is in the camera. As I said, every lens that you put in the camera will have stabilization if you have in-body image stabilization. Now, the optical image stabilization actually goes by different names depending on the manufacturer. So some manufacturer calls it vibration reduction, other manufacturers calls it image stabilization, other manufacturers call it vibration compensation, and so on and so on. But it just basically works the same way. It works by moving the elements within the lens to counteract any vibration detected by its sensors. Now, how can we use the benefit of IBIS and IS for low light photography? Well, when we're learning the fundamentals of photography, we need to consider the fact that we shouldn't have a shutter speed that is slower than the focal length. So if you're shooting with a 50mm lens, you want to shoot at least at 1/50th of a second to avoid camera shake. At a 200mm lens, you should be shooting at 1/20th, 1/200th of a second or higher. For a 400mm lens, at 1/400th of a second, and it goes on and on and on. But with image stabilization, be it in body or in lens, theoretically, at 1/200th of a second on a 200mm focal length lens, you can actually go down to 1/13th of a second, which is 4 stops of exposure. But we need to consider some points though with image stabilization. The first point we should consider is that image stabilization is far more effective in a telephoto lens. It's far more effective in a telephoto lens. As I mentioned earlier, a subtle shake of the camera is pretty drastic when you're shooting at 500mm compared to 16mm. And also, the second point you should consider is that, in general, in-lens stabilization is much more effective than in-body image stabilization. Now, whilst many camera companies will say that, oh no, IBIS is the same level as in-lens stabilization, it's simply not the case. Because in-lens stabilization is tuned specifically to the lens, the quality and the characteristics of the lens. And it offers you multiple image stabilization options depending on the situation. And this is actually one of the reasons why Canon has been refraining from using IBIS in any of their cameras until they've released the R5 that's going to come out soon, and the R6 as well. They'll have IBIS. Now, the last point I want you guys to consider is that image stabilization does not help with fast-moving subjects. So when you're taking an image, for example, a family portrait or something like people in dark, you might see that the picture is blurry. Now, that is not the fault of the image stabilization, but the fact that you want to be shooting at a minimum of 1/60th of a second to avoid that. For example, if you're shooting at 24mm, the lowest you can go is 1/20th of a second shutter speed, but that's going to produce a blurry image because people are moving. You should be shooting at minimum of 1/60th of a second to show that you can actually capture that movement. It's not really the fault of the camera, rather the settings that you're using. So keep that in mind when you're shooting with image stabilization. So moving on to actually the basic techniques that I would recommend for you guys to shoot at night. The first technique that I would recommend is shooting a minimum of 3 shots per image. Because when you press your camera, you're actually causing shake in the camera. And when you release the shutter button, you're actually causing shake in the camera. So by shooting a minimum of 3 shots per image. The middle one is most likely going to be blur free. The second tip I would like to give is bracketed exposures. Now, as Clarence demonstrated earlier, bracketed exposure is really great for merging an image with different exposures, because at night you have very dynamic lighting conditions that's constantly changing, and it's difficult to have a correct exposure when taking at night. So by having bracketed exposures, what you're going to do is you're going to capture the dark part of the image, you're going to capture the normal correct exposure, what the camera thinks, and the brighter parts of the image, so the light of the image. So there's different ways of doing this, but I'm going to show you how to do it on a Canon camera. The fundamentals are basically the same. So basically, you're going to want to click the menu on your camera button. Then in the menu, you want to go and find exposure compensation, or more specifically, auto exposure bracketing. So after you click that, it'll take you to the auto exposure bracketing menu. Now, most cameras have auto exposure bracketing of -2 to what your camera thinks is normal to +2. Now, -2, normal, +2 would be used in landscape when you have a sunset. You want to take the dark foreground, the normal, and then the bright background with the sunset. But for night photography, what I recommend is -1 normal +1, or -1/3 normal +1/3. That gives you a good balance of the darks, the normal range, and then the bright highlights as well. So that's how you'd use auto exposure bracketing, by taking these 3 different pictures and using the one you think is the best, or merging them together. Now, my fourth recommendation is actually to use aperture priority when you're taking night photography. A lot of people say use manual, but when you're doing handheld, you have so many things that you have to think about. You have to think about your composition, your shutter speed, your ISO, your aperture. And I personally think that it's going to hurt your composition of the image, how you're taking the image, and your exposure as well. So personally, when I'm doing handheld night photography, I always use aperture priority. If your camera has that function of setting a minimum shutter speed, I always try to set a minimum shutter speed of 1/60th of a second if I'm shooting people at night. I like to set auto ISO, and also like to set a limit. So different cameras have different limits of ISO where the image quality degrades significantly. It'll depend on what camera you're using. But for my beginner Canon camera, it's about 1600 ISO. But you guys should just play around and see what works for you. And then set your desired aperture. So by doing this, it'll actually allow you to focus easier and control your hand movements. And it's just one less thing to think about. Then the fourth tip I would say, or this tip in general applies to photography as a whole, go away from JPEG and shoot RAW. If you can only shoot one file format, I would shoot RAW. Ideally, if your camera allows to shoot JPEG and RAW, you would want to do that, because I'll admit it myself, I've taken pictures and I couldn't be able to edit them. So shooting RAW is the best option. So in terms of RAW, why do I recommend shooting RAW? First of all, as Clarence demonstrated in his live demo, with RAW you can actually adjust the white balance. So with Clarence in his Hong Kong nightscape photo, he had a very warm tone in the picture, and by adjusting the white balance, you could actually make it much more cooler to the desired image that he wanted. Color depth as well. We saw Clarence editing a lot of the colors of the image. He wanted the colors that he envisions in the image rather than what the camera took as well. So by shooting RAW, you have much more range in terms of colors you can choose. And in my opinion, one of the most important parts is noise reduction and sharpness. When you take a picture with a RAW file and you see a picture with your phone, you'll see that the phone applies noise reduction throughout the image. It doesn't really detect the face that well compared to yourself. You know where the face is, you know what the exact edges of the picture is, so you can make the face sharp with a bit of noise, which is okay, because no one's gonna zoom into the picture that much. But looking at the picture as a whole, if you have a bit of noise in the face, because you have all these lines and definition in the face, it's hard to see the noise. But the backgrounds, you can blur it out. It adds to the depth of field of the image. So that's why shooting RAW is highly recommended. And now, another common technique that is often recommended by people is to shoot underexposed. What that basically means is that to shoot the image a bit darker, because in editing and post-processing, when you're shooting RAW, by shooting underexposed, it allows you to have greater dynamic range. Now, personally, what I found is that this might work for more expensive cameras, but with beginner cameras which have limited dynamic range compared to the higher end cameras, especially at nighttime, when you're shooting darker and trying to lift the shadows up and make the image brighter, what you're actually doing, you're showing the grain. It's like a curtain. So when it's dark, the curtain's hiding all the grain, but when you're bringing the shadows up, you're taking the curtain away and all the grain is being shown. And you'll need a lot of heavy noise removal for that image to look proper, and it just makes the image too blurry. So personally, I say that always try to shoot with the correct exposure with a bit of grain. And my last tip is patience. Night photography is one of the most difficult types of photography you're going to face. The conditions are dynamic, they're always changing. So what I recommend is you shoot, you look at the image, you change your settings. You shoot, you look at the image, and you change your settings. And you constantly have to do that. And that's just the fact with night photography. By doing that, you'll ensure that there's a higher chance of getting the image that you want. Now, so we talked about handheld photography. So moving on to tripods. What to look for in a tripod. Now, ideally, you want to be wanting a carbon fiber tripod. Whilst they are quite expensive, in the long run, they're much more durable. Like when I first started photography, everyone buys the first cheap tripod. That's just, how you get into photography. But what I realized is that in the long run, if you're going to continue this hobby, getting a good quality tripod is essential. Instead of buying a lower quality tripod that you need to replace every year, buying a good quality tripod that's going to last you at least 5 years is very important. And with carbon fiber tripods, considering the fact that they're already quite expensive, they're in general going to be better quality than aluminium tripods. Another advantage of a carbon fiber tripod is that it actually absorbs much less vibration than an aluminium tripod. So if you're shooting and there's people walking past you, or there's wind, or there's car movement, the carbon fiber tripod absorbs much of that vibration. And it's also much lighter weight. The second point is to consider is the leg diameter. Now, people see different tripods and they're like, why is this tripod made out of carbon fiber and that one made out of carbon fiber, but they cost different prices? That's because of, first of all, the number of layers of carbon fiber that's used in a tripod, and also the diameter. The higher the diameter, the more material that's being used, the more difficult the manufacturing process, the more expensive it is, but the more stable it is. And the third point that I recommend to have a look at is the weight. Just like the best camera is the one that you have, the one that you carry with, the best tripod is the one that you have with you. You need to consider in what application you're going to use your tripod. Are you going to be using it for hiking, walking long distances, traveling, or are you going to be taking it in your car and going out to a location at night and taking pictures? That's going to affect the weight of the tripod that you can carry. So in general, the better the more hefty it is, the more it weighs, the better its stability. And in talking about weight, if your main concern is about having a lower weight so you can move around, is to get a tripod that has a bag hook. Basically, it'll instantly add a couple of kilos to the tripod, which will improve its stability much more. And portability, as I said, depending on the situation, you want to buy a tripod for that. If you want to travel, you want a very small tripod. If you want, a tripod that you can take for, in landscape photography with your car, you want a much heavier tripod. Depends on the situation. Now, mini tripods are another consideration as well. These are especially when you're taking nightscapes in the city. You can use them in railings, ledge of windows, and areas where big tripods are not allowed. You can just, sneak in your mini tripod and take some nice pictures where you couldn't with a larger tripod. Now, in terms of how to use a tripod properly, there's again a few considerations you need to take when using a tripod properly. The first thing that I recommend is don't just indiscriminately release the tripod legs. When you're using a tripod, first think about what height you need, and the first release should be the top legs, because they have the thickest diameter, so they're the most sturdiest part of the tripod. So you're going to be releasing the top legs first. If you don't get enough height, the second legs, the third legs, the third is the last legs, and then finally you want to be retracting the center column. The center column is the weakest part of the tripod. That's where you're going to get the most shake in the tripod, and you want to be retracting that last. The third point, whilst IBIS and OIS is great for handheld night photography, I recommend you actually turn it off for tripod use. Because what IBIS and OIS actually does is that it looks for camera shake. When it sees camera shake, it adjusts the sensor or the lens to compensate for that. But when you don't have any camera shake, the IBIS and OIS will be like, oh, what's going on? I'm going to just shake the sensor because I don't know what's going on. That's going to clear a bit of blurriness in the image. It's going to make it less sharp. So for the best quality night photography, you want to be turning off IBIS and OIS in your lens and your camera. My fourth point is, as I said before, use a bag as a weight. It's the cheapest and best way to make your tripod, whatever you buy. If it's a $100 tripod or a $1,000 tripod, it's going to make it much more effective and sturdy. And my last point is to actually use a shutter delay. Shutter delays are great is because you're minimizing the shake from depressing and releasing the camera. And by doing this, what it does is that it minimizes the amount of shake you have. Personally, what I recommend is getting a remote shutter because you can actually control when your camera's gonna the shutter's gonna go off instead of using a 2-second timer, because then you have to predict when the camera shutter's gonna go off. For example, in Vivid, if in last year when people came to Vivid with us, we had all these ferries going across the Opera House. If you're using a 2-second delay, you have to predict, oh, in 2 seconds the ferry's gonna be here and I want that going across my frame. But if you're using a remote shutter, as soon as the ferry is on the corner of the frame, you can press it and the shutter will go off. So that's why shutter delays, highly recommended by myself. So the best way to learn, first of all, is learn by doing. And the second best way to learn is actually looking at what other people have done. So I'm just going to show you some sources where you can get some nice inspiration ideas. The first place and the original place where I got my inspiration is YouTube. So photographers like Peter McKinnon have amazing tutorials on capturing the best night images possible. It's engaging, it's fun, and he talks you through the process. Other YouTubers like North Borders are great as well. They talk a lot about car photography at night and how to edit your photos. It's a very good platform to use. The second platform I would say is Instagram. Instagram, very simple. You use hashtag night photography and you can find all these different varieties of night photography. It's fast and it's easy and has a vast selection of images to look at. So as you can see this nice bokeh and the nice astrophotography that Chris covered. Then going on to Facebook. Personally, I find that this is my favorite type of inspiration source. With Facebook groups, you can actually join the local camera club or your local camera brand club. And this is where you'll have access to the knowledge of about thousands of enthusiastic photographers who will share amazing images with the camera and lens that you actually have. So you can get similar results if you follow the techniques that they suggest. And they're so responsive and they're so willing to help with you guys with any questions you have. It's just a very awesome community. And if you guys want some editing help with your pictures, what I recommend is Anthony Morganti on YouTube. He's really a great source for editing all types of pictures, not only night photography, but for landscapes, portraits, and he really teaches you the fundamentals of photo editing. So what he teaches you, for example, portraiture, you can easily apply in night photography. So it's a very good platform to use. So that's basically it for the tutorial today. I hope you guys enjoyed, our Astro tutorial, the night photography tutorial, and the demonstration that we showed you. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat right now. I'll just have a look if there's any questions, and then we can go on from there. Let's see. Okay, so Michael asked, would you advise to get some kind of Gorilla Pod easy to carry around? Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Gorilla Pods are great because you can attach them on railings, and especially with smaller cameras, they're very nice. We actually use a lot of our PhotoClub members use Gorilla Pods in Vivid. So what we do is we went on top of the bridge to capture the Opera House and the Harbor Bridge, and by using the Gorilla Pods, it allowed us to adjust much better to the composition that we wanted. So Gorilla Pods are nice. I also recommend mini tripods, which are really tiny. That's great as well. You just look around, go to physical camera shops. That's a great thing about having all these camera shops in the city, especially George's. They have a wide selection of tripods that you can use. Just go to them, ask them, I'm interested in buying a tripod. And you don't have to buy on that day. Like, they just show you all their tripods. They're very warm and friendly. So yeah, that's what I recommend. Let's see if anyone else has any other questions. So that's a great question. So I don't think there's any more questions. So thanks guys for tuning in to our Astro night photography tutorial. We hope you enjoyed it. Stay safe, and if you need anything, more than happy to help via our social media and Chris's email and phone number. feel free to reach out. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.